The degree of control that can be imposed by a data management system is directly related to the number of policy enforcement points. Policy enforcement points are created in middleware to control interactions with users, interactions with technology, and the properties of a collection. Each of these areas requires a different set of policies. The simplest set to consider are policies related to managing interactions with users. Each action initiated by a user is trapped at a set of policy enforcement points. The actions may be related to file manipulation, metadata manipulation, and report generation. Note that the administrator of a data grid is a user of the data grid, and the administrator's actions also need to be controlled. Managing interactions with technology requires separate controls for each technology component that is plugged into the data grid. This adds an arbitrary number of policy enforcement points to the system, since multiple types of storage systems, authentication systems, transport systems, and external services may be plugged into the middleware. Managing the properties of a collection is yet another set of policy enforcement points that ensure and verify collection properties. The expectation is that the collection properties are retained while different user actions and different technologies flow through the middleware controlling the collection. This viewpoint treats the collection as the invariant entity, while new user communities access the collection and new technologies are embedded within the infrastructure. An implication is that the policies associated with the collection management may be relatively invariant, while the policies needed to manage users and technologies will evolve over time. The IROD's data grid comes with about 70 default policy enforcement points where actions are trapped and policies are applied. These enforcement points are listed in Appendix A of the microservice workbook. Additional policy enforcement points are created each time new technology is plugged into the middleware. Examples include policy enforcement points for new microservices, new storage systems, and new clients. The default policy enforcement points can be categorized into 8 task management areas: access management, which control what users can do; data processing, which manipulates files; collection management, which creates new collections; user management, to create new users and their home directories; resource management, to select default resources, create new resources; metadata management, to add, remove, and list metadata; quota management, to enforce quotas on users, groups, and resources; ticket management, to manage properties of tickets. For the 70 default policy enforcement points, the IROD's data grid comes with only 14 default policies. These are sufficient to manage data sharing in a distributed environment. These default policies are listed in the Policy Examples Workbook in Chapter 2. 3 types of policy enforcement points were originally created to control actions. These were pre-process enforcement points, typically named starting with AC pre-proc, that were used to manipulate input before any operations were applied. An example is choosing which default resource to use for storing a file based on a file property. Post-process enforcement points, typically named starting with AC post-proc, that were used to manipulate objects after the action was completed. An example is replicating a file after the original is successfully stored. Action enforcement points, typically named starting with AC, that control the execution of an action. An example is a constraint that restricts application of the policy to a specific collection. The creation of additional policy enforcement points for each technology plugged into the middleware plugin operation uses the following naming conventions: PEP plugin operations PRE for pre-process control of the plugin, PEP plugin operation post for post-process control of the plugin. When rules are added to the rule base, the name of the rule must conform to the name of the policy enforcement point. Dynamically generated policy enforcement points are automatically created to manage new microservices, storage drivers, and authentication mechanisms. The default policy enforcement points are listed here. These are sorted by action control, pre-processing, and post-processing policy enforcement points. For example, there is an AC pre-proc for modify user and an AC post-proc for modify user. Not all of these policy enforcement points have policies associated with them. Most of them in practice have default operations of nothing happens at that particular policy enforcement point. A single client action may invoke multiple policy enforcement points. A nice example is to track each of the policy enforcement points that are applied when a file is put into the data grid, as shown here. The first three policy enforcement points are related to access control, whether the client host is allowed access, whether public access is being attempted, and enforcement of access controls on a file or a collection. Policies are then applied to determine which storage resource to use, whether a quota has been exceeded, how to name the file on the storage system, whether metadata needs to be added or modified, and whether post-processing needs to be performed. A simple action will usually require application of multiple policies to control the outcome. There are multiple cases where specific actions may need to be controlled across all policy enforcement points. The two most common examples are the imposition of event auditing for every action and the imposition of multi-level security controls. Instead of creating a policy for each of the policy enforcement points, a meta-policy can be written. The meta-policy is executed at each policy enforcement point before any other policy. The meta-policies are implemented through a hierarchical namespace. Thus, auditing may be the first meta-policy, followed by security as a second-level meta-policy. Meta-policies simplify the creation of policies that are applied at dynamic policy enforcement points. The approach is shown here. For each plugin, pre- and post-policy enforcement points are created. A meta-policy can be applied at each of the policy enforcement points automatically. The architecture supports the creation of policies written in multiple languages. Thus, the iRODS rule language or Python or JavaScript can be used to write the rules. Take 7 minutes to complete exercise 26. Identify the policy enforcement points that will be most important for your collaboration. Possibilities include data management, metadata management, arrangement, external repository access. Please load a paragraph about your conclusions into the Lifetime Library in the sub-collection class INLS 624 by the end of today's class.